Hello, everybody. We're live. Welcome to Virtually Connecting from OpenEd 15. We have an awesome panel today, and without further ado, we will go to OpenEd for introductions and then online introductions.
Okay, great. I hope you can hear me okay. It's Martin Weller here in Vancouver. Do not swear, you're live on TV. So we've had an excellent keynote from Mary and David. I'll let them introduce themselves and we'll introduce the virtual people as well.
Hi, I'm David Porter, Associate Vice President, British Columbia Institute of Technology.
And I'm Mary Burgess, Executive Director at BC Campus.
And on the virtual side, my name is Helen DeWard, and very happy and proud to say I'm an MET graduate, so my virtual connecting is coming as a direct result of that.
Yeah, me too.
I'm Maha Bali from Egypt. I'm the co-founder of Virtually Connecting.
And I'm Maha Abdelman. I'm also from Cairo, Egypt. I'm a trainer, coach, and always learning.
And I think Claire has audio issues, but we have also Claire Coulter with us.
Oh, great. Did I see Laura in there as well? Have we lost Laura? Okay. So perhaps we'll kick off the discussion here and more people join. So we had a keynote from Mary and David, and they plotted a really nice kind of history of how they got to BC Campus, and I really appreciate that history. Actually, I think often we're not very good at recording our own history in EdTech and open education. So perhaps just to kind of pick out some of the themes from that. I thought it was interesting. First of all, David, you were saying that it's a 13-year pathway. Obviously, where you start can go back, but you said there were some kind of missteps along the way. I think that's also important. I tend to think that everything has to be a success. I wonder if you wanted to just touch upon what you thought some of the missteps were, not necessarily mistakes.
Yeah, no, for sure. I'd be happy to. I mean, I think our idea at BC Campus in the early days was to collaboratively develop and share content in the educational space and higher education. And so the notion of openness and a licensing scheme for open was really hard to convince our government to support with funding in the early days. And our biggest misstep early on was not to go with Creative Commons licensing. It was going with a more localized license that was geographically bound to British Columbia and British Columbia educators, simply because our government didn't really understand that the sharing concept had to be much broader to be effective, and they wanted to make sure that the investment was an investment in their people, in a sense. And that was a huge misstep, and we had to repatriate all kinds of things that we built in the early days and get them relicensed after the fact, which was more work than going open right in the beginning.
Yeah, that's interesting. The other thing that sort of came out, I think, quite clearly, and I think you can both speak to this, was how the work you've done in BC Campus grew out of a kind of a culture of experimentation, innovation, and that's kind of, I got to know a lot of those people you talked to, like Scott, Brian, and stuff. It really came from that kind of blogging culture. I'm not sure what the question is there, but I think there's something about how you couldn't predict where this stuff will go to, I think.
Yeah.
No.
But you can see those threads as you go through it.
Yeah, I mean, I think having all of that, as you say, I mean, these were early ed tech people, right? And there was a lot of experimentation in that space for quite a long time. But as I said in the presentation, I think at a certain point, in order for us to kind of say, okay, we're now going to do something big that is going to involve more than us and our friends, we have to focus on something that people who we want to bring into the community will understand. And so that's why the textbook piece made sense at that point, right? It's to kind of bring that together for people.
Yeah, we also had a very benevolent government at the time, and our government funders of the day were people who were not the senior people in government, but there were people who could actually make cash flow to us, and they were broadly invested in the notion of experimentation, that we don't really know what will work. We don't really know where we're going, but let's be bold and find out some good directions. And I think that was another part that attracted people like Scott Leslie into our midst to do things that we allowed them to continue to do in a bold and expressive way. It was very much a kind of an expansive learning model.
Maybe, sorry, the eType user group is kind of an amazing.
Exactly, and that's the community I'm talking about, right? Like those were our early friends and experimenters, and that community has continued to be super supportive of us and of the expansion of this, while also continuing to be what eTug is, which is experimental and a really safe space for people to try things. So yeah, a big difference.
I think that was a thing that came through very strongly from both of you, was the importance of community. So it grew out of that kind of early experimental community.
Yeah.
And then I think the point you made, Mary, was kind of how much other people helped you as well. So once you kind of made that, so you kind of spoke to the OpenStax people, there's kind of a big community there. Yeah. And now it's community who are then taking the textbooks and adapting and adopting them. So it's kind of, I think we always kind of say, isn't community nice? But I think it's a very clear message that kind of at each stage how important it was.
Well, and I think it was really interesting for us to put this together, I think, because I think we knew that, but having to really articulate it made us kind of look at, well, who were the players and what was the role that those people played, and where do they think we're going to go next, having experienced all of that along with us. So, yeah.
The where next thing is interesting, I think. And I like the point you made about open textbooks being, in some ways, it's the thing that people can get.
Yeah.
And learning objects were, you have to spend an hour explaining what a learning object is. I know what a textbook is.
Yes.
So I think they're an easy sell in some ways. Yeah. And you touched it, and some people touched upon it at the end of the talk about the where next thing. And I think there's a kind of, there's an analogy with the LMS here in a way. So the LMS kind of got us quite far very quickly in terms of learning, but then it became the end point in itself. Yeah. So I just want to get into about how do we stop textbooks being the kind of the end point? Actually, I think that there are vehicles doing more interesting things.
I mean, I think we have examples of how that's working now, and that's one of the reasons I like Tidewater as an example so much, because not only did they use textbooks, they stripped the courses to outcomes and redesign. And so there was a real focus on better instruction and better learning experiences for students. And I think that's really where we need to go next in terms of our thinking about this, because for many people, that will be the sell, is better student experiences. And so that's why, textbooks have been the vehicle, but now we need to have the conversation more broadly about open practices generally.
I work at an Institute of Technology, and so we're really thinking differently, at least our faculty are, about what an open contribution could be. It could actually be a data set of experimental data. It could be a template built for 3D lathes or something that would be worked out on a 3D printer. In fact, they're already doing it. They're building widgets internally that help other faculty to do things, as opposed to building nice little Eiffel Towers and things like that. They're actually building stuff that other people can use and giving them access to the blueprint.
Okay, I'm going to see if there are any. Open it up to the audience for questions. Okay. So does anyone have any questions?
I have two very quick questions, then I hope other people will have questions as well. I think I lost you. Okay, you're here. I just lost you for a second. One of the questions is, you talked a lot about the role of the government, the particular people in the government at that point, and the kind of funding you were getting, and that scared me a little bit, because it meant that people, your source of funding is something that isn't necessarily replicable, transferable to other people. So I was wondering what you advise people who are somewhere else to do that. And I couldn't hear Mary say something right there, so I'm worried about the audio. But the second question, I can hear you now. Okay. And my second question relates to what you said earlier about the text. I think you said something about the textbook being like a lowest common denominator for all faculty, something that everyone can talk about. So is that like sort of your way to make the community really inclusive by going to the lowest level of openness that you could probably get? So I just wanted to confirm that.
Yeah, I'll let David talk about the government piece, because that was much more his part of the project, or early days. The comment that I made under my breath was, not only is it that it might not be replicable, but it's also not stable. because you're dependent on individuals with an interest. And so yes, that is definitely a problem. And yeah, absolutely. The textbook piece, I think, is just, it's just easy to understand. Everybody knows what it is. It's not an abstract concept that people who aren't part of the education business will wonder what the heck you're talking about. So yeah, you want to talk about the...
Yeah, I think it's a transitional piece too. I think one of the things we have to do with policy is embed openness in practice within the institution so that it becomes part of an institutional planning process for faculty and instructors, and they budget appropriately around it. The library is a big focus for me in doing that at my own institution. So the sustainability probably will have to shift with funding from government to institutions downstream, and that's the real sustainability practice. That is to build that culture in the institution so that it becomes part of its normal instructional development process and practice.
I was going to actually just ask that, so I'm glad you brought up the idea of the institution. Laura Pasquini, I'm in the open. You can see my clouds there. Calling in from Texas, outside my department, and we're at a University of North Texas. We adopted an open access policy in a few different ways, and so we're very much a fan of promoting what this means within an institution, sharing of knowledge and sharing of resources. And it's great because our library folks are wonderful and information science folks are wonderful. The faculty are on board. But then there's some rigidity with the staff and sharing because there's different rights and access. And we actually just had a great faculty meeting, as we all do, debating on intellectual property and rights and access and knowledge. And I wonder how you recommend institutions to go about it, because although we have it, it's still not perfect. It's not perfectly adopted. Implementation was good, and we try and support it on a yearly focus on different areas. But what are some recommendations for institutionalizing the openness that you're talking about in policy and practice?
Well, I think it comes at a whole bunch of different levels. I think the institution's intellectual policy process needs to be refined. I'm trying to work on that with our unions right now. They're the biggest, actually, blocking points in our going forward. And it came up in an interesting way. Faculty believed that their image was their intellectual property, and that students could not use their cell phones to copy whiteboards and equations and things like that. And so I've just gone through a round with our faculty union to say, actually, the Canadian copyright policy would consider that fair dealing or fair use in the US, and you can't write a policy around it except one that respects courtesy and you know, simple things like, I'd like to copy your image, or I'd like to copy the equation. It made them start thinking about IP more seriously. And it was situated. It was something that came up that we were able to springboard from. And now we can broaden it.
You've just said a dirty word in Texas. I'm formerly Canadian, so union doesn't happen. But I do think you do bring up a good point on identity management, digital management, digital artifacts, objects, because it's more than just a textbook and our learning objects, because I think that's a question that's going to come out, and how to best tackle that. I'd love responses from anyone on the panel as well, so not to put you all on the hot seat there, or y'all as they say here on the hot seat, but if anyone else has suggestions, please.
I mean, I think one of the other things, again, that I talked about in the keynote was the plow, right? We need senior administrators, because that is, for many people, as much as there's tension between faculty and administrators and institutions, there is something about having your VP academic endorse an activity within an institution that really makes people get on board. And we've seen that time and time again when we've tried to get various inroads into an institution and have a hard time, and then the VP academic sends out an email to everybody saying, hey, you should check out these open textbooks, and boom, we've got 5 adoptions. So I think that is a huge piece of changing institutional culture as senior leadership.
Who was it in your presentation with open culture shift?
Alan Davis, and he's a president, which is fantastic.
Yeah, he's a kind of, I think Laura's right, it's kind of
So can I jump in and ask then, do you see this more as a grassroots bottom-up, you know, the tinkerers and makers in the academics, or a top-down, or kind of it needs to be both?
It definitely needs to be both. And I think to date, we've had the tinkerers, we've had the maker culture, and that's gotten us a really long way. But now we need the other side to go to the next level, and so it's absolutely both.
Dave Ernst at the University of Minnesota had a really cool strategy early on, which was to take all of the open content that was out there in the commons and put it on his own website at the University of Minnesota under a University of Minnesota banner, and that carried with it some implied authority. Somehow this was vetted by the institution, approved by the institution, and became a way of working with faculty to think differently about where resources come from and how they get organized for their use. My next move is to ask Mary if I can white label the BC Campus Open Textbook Review site on my campus, because I want to borrow that Dave Ernst strategy and move it out that way. And that's kind of a top-down move, but we've also got authors who are looking for a place to put their work.
Now, one of the questions that came up yesterday, thought about it but didn't have an opportunity to ask, is what are your views on forking? So if you're looking at open source software, I apologize for the lower third, I'm Mr. Wilson today from Home Improvement or House Improvement. But one of the things that I've seen in OERs, it's sort of like when I'm looking at repositories, like, okay, this is nice, but 60% of it isn't applicable for me, and I can't edit it, so it's not really all that useful, so forget about it. I'd really love to fork it, but the raw materials aren't there. How important do you think forking is in this process of openness?
Crucial. Yeah, and that's, I mean, in our project, we've made a point of having a variety of digital file formats available so that people can do that kind of forking. Where I think the complication comes, and that we have not resolved to really any degree, is we have a version in the BC Campus repository. Somebody in an institution forks it and makes what might be a better version than what we have, but we don't necessarily know that. We may love to have that back in our collection, but then if we have both resources, how do we tell people what the difference is between them? And then there's another version and another version. So that's yet another thing that we need to look at. But I do think there's a ton to be learned from the open source software world, who are way ahead of us in that regard.
Did you ever feel for how many people do actually adapt to use it as is?
My understanding is that the vast majority of people just adopt.
Yeah, they do. I think our early research, when we were doing courseware and learning objects, pointed us to, through surveys, that people wanted the entire work, not the pieces. They actually liked a coherent whole, and they would modify from there, that rather than build it from the bottom up. I think that's what the open textbook movement seems to be servicing. It's funny, Scott Leslie, that we talked about this morning in the keynote, Scott in the early days was trying to write code, I think even with Martin's group, on so that OER resources could call home and tell when they were being revised.
Oh, that'd be awesome.
It's a grand dream.
And that was a cool idea, because it would allow you to have an almost a federated version control system. And nobody's done that yet that I know of. Maybe the GitHub community does that. Maybe that's the metaphor or model we need to adapt.
But it does get in some of the issues that people have about like their work being recognized as their work once it gets forked several times.
Exactly. Yeah, it has to do with what we call in Canada moral rights, and that's the big piece that people worry about. It's not so much that my work is being used, but someone may be using it inappropriately from my perspective.
So there's some text come through here. I haven't got my glasses on. So, I'm sorry about my face leering into the screen. Must be quite scary for you all at home.
Well, I mean, Claire wants to ask a question, but she doesn't want to take time to... Yeah, I wanted to try talking. Give it a...
Okay, yeah. Can you hear me or no?
Yeah.
Yes? Success. I was afraid that I wouldn't again. I would distract. Hi, everyone. My name's Claire. I'm an instructional technologist at the University of Guelph. I'm also a student at Athabasca right now. And my coursework this semester is actually on openness in education. So I've been really enjoying following along this week. And thanks for having me. So I just had a couple of quick questions. One is, I work at an institution where we do not have necessarily any sort of strategy in this area. So now I'm just wondering, let alone a provincial one, what are one or two like tangible things you might recommend to someone in my role that I could, leave this conversation and actually put into action?
I mean, I think as an instructional technologist type person, you have a unique opportunity in your work with faculty to really talk them through this process. And I think that's why I'm saying we really need instructional design groups now, because that is a place where we move from just replacing a textbook with a textbook to redesigning curriculum in ways that is much more effective and makes use of open. And so I think as you're working with faculty, take the opportunity to have those conversations with them about, yes, that would be great if you replaced your textbook, but let's look at the outcomes for your course and how we could actually do this differently. And talk to your friends and talk to senior administrators.
There was a talk, sorry, this is Alan on the side, Heather Ross at University of Saskatchewan, her thing is education developers as open textbook reps, and
Absolutely.
She's adamant, but she says she talks about open textbooks every time she can. Yeah. So I think your connections with the faculty are a great avenue just to seed them with ideas, not necessarily you have to convince them all at once.
Yeah.
We've created an OER working group on our campus that's made up of librarians, instructional designers, and faculty members who've been open textbook authors, and they're going to be our kind of vanguard to move it out in the institution. And one of the things we pointed them to are two documents. One is a website from La Trobe University in Australia, which has a wonderful open website that explains all the concepts of open and what it means for policy, what it means for tenure. It gives people that kind of grounding. What's this open thing about? The other we pointed them to is the Tidewater policy that we've just seen recently, Tidewater Community College, because it gets into the real nuts and bolts of how do you support faculty and what policies would we put in place if people decide to go in the open direction? Where do they go for help? How much time do they get to do it? Those kinds of things are really important levers for faculty, because things that save them time and improve the lot of their students are the primary drivers in their lives.
The other thing I'd add into that, I think that I've picked up a lot at the conference this week, is have answers to the questions, the objections that people will raise. So people like David Wiley, that they've done really good research in his group and some of our OER Hub group, and also the work at Tidal. Like people say, like, so David has the grumpy cat hypothesis. People say, you can get what you pay for, kind of thing, and they've kind of done the research. Say, no, that isn't true, or I'm worried that it's not going to be as good as the textbook I use, and you can demonstrate this stuff is effective. So I think having that research to kind of back up the common objections, I think, is really important for going armed with that work.
It's interesting. Picked up on a thread that came to mind when we had an OER conference at my university last spring. One of the things that came up is that faculty don't get credit or as much credit for writing textbooks in their manual faculty reviews or tenure and promotion cases. At least at my university, I don't know how it is elsewhere. I'm thinking, how do you encourage faculty beyond altruism to develop resources like these and share them when everybody's thinking about tenure and promotion? What is the, do you know what the climate is out there on this issue?
I think it depends on the institution. Where we've had the most, the largest number of barriers is with research institutions where the tenure track is largely dependent on the publish-or-perish model. And so we've had a lot more traction with teaching institutions and colleges. But again, I would go back to the notion of what senior administrators can do to change the culture at an institution. And as I was saying in the talk, our big research institutions are, one is working on and one has a teaching tenure track. And to me, that's a signal that that teaching and learning has become much more high profile in the institutions, even the research institutions. And so I think we need to capitalize on that and make that part of what's valued in the institutions.
I'd come in on that, George. this kind of question always comes up with anything in this kind of area. I talk about digital scholarship a lot, and it comes up there. I think often there's a trick in talking about it in the language and the terms that people use. So if you talk about impact, that kind of stuff, the sort of terms that are all this kind of tenure is often couched in, then often you can play the game, as it were. But we need to kind of be creative about using that terminology and structuring the systems to work for us.
A suggestion for getting started at your campus, because Guelph is my alumni association, for the earlier question, might be to go a bit rogue and get in with your library and information science folks, because they tend to be, I don't know, maybe that's why I've aligned myself with them a little bit more. They tend to be really clever in bringing people together. So I'm going to an activity this afternoon. It's awkward. It's called Collaborating with Strangers. You could have openness with strangers. It's random invites and bringing people together and talking about different topics on research and sneak in the openness, or talk about it during key points of the year and have some conversations and just plant the seed with key champions and people within different departments that that already do things a little bit different in the open area and openness. So I think finding those champions will help modify your culture, and it's very slow to change culture, which will be your biggest issue, but at least you'll start the conversation into opening it to a wider audience. So having small roundtables, little summits, little random something with strangers, I don't know, make up some different events to invite different key players, both administrators, faculty, support staff, graduate students. They're actually really good too, because they're looking for free stuff. They have no money. Open quality stuff to have those conversations might be a good way to instigate. And I have to leave, but I want to say thank you, Virtually Connecting and Maha Friends, for putting this on. And it's good to know the weirdo is Alan in the side. I didn't see him, so thank you.
I see you, Laura.
Thanks, Laura.
Bye, friends.
There may actually be already people in your campus or on your campus doing open stuff you don't know about. And I had one of those recently when we put our OER working group together. He came forward and said, hey, I wrote an open textbook on OpenStax 3 years ago.
Oh, really?
And his preface to his open textbook says something like this: in recognition of all the support I've had at the institution, I wrote this as a gift for my colleagues. It's like fantastic. He's my poster child now. He's an engineer. He wrote an engineering text.
Are there any other questions on the text? Can you read them out, Maha? Is there any there to save my big face doing?
I think Claire has another question, so I'll let her ask it.
Oh, yeah, thanks. I was just thinking about when Michael and Phil were talking in the first keynote, there seemed to be near the end there some connections drawn between, or sort of the idea of how can we make administrators, quote unquote, care about this, and there was some connection drawn between, the use of OER, increased student satisfaction, and therefore can you make the jump to, improved retention. And I'm just wondering if that is something that you've seen in your experience in British Columbia. Like, can you speak to that in any way? I don't know if that comment on the other day was, can you just comment on it? Would be helpful.
I think we're too early on to know whether or not we're having an impact in that way in British Columbia, but I do know that the data that they have from Tidewater Community College is showing higher retention rates, both for the institution and within individual classes, and greater student success in the Z courses as opposed to the non-Z. So there is some research data emerging now around that.
Thank you.
It's a really good point, Helen. I think that's retention is the thing that if you want to sell it to people, retention is something they really care about.
It's huge. Huge.
If you can increase it by 2%, 5%, that's big money.
And it's also, it's huge money. My institution graduates 87% of our student intake, and so a lot of our faculty think, hey, we're doing a fantastic job. They graduate, they get jobs. But we find that there's a huge dip between first and second year, and we've just begun to identify all the difficult bits that students fail and drop out on, and we're going to make that the focus for our development process. So this is the perfect place to say, let's try open development here and measure it to see what happens.
Thanks.
Okay, I'm going to jump in because we're talking Canadian contexts and talking with Canadians who are dispersed to states unknown. The question is, do you see what's happening in BC extending across provinces and territories? I know that there's a huge OER movement in Ontario with Contact North materials and resources. It's a nice place for a lot of faculty to start, but do you see this sort of pebble in the pond with the current Canadian educational context, because it's a provincial concern, not necessarily a national, federal level concern?
We've been making some headway in that regard lately, actually, quite a bit of headway. So a year or so ago, our premier signed an MOU with the premiers of Alberta and Saskatchewan, part of which was related to sharing our work around OER. And we have also recently established a relationship with our counterpart in Manitoba. And so we've been doing some collaboration with all of those groups, and in particular with Manitoba. BC Campus is actually managing a review process on behalf of them so that faculty in Manitoba review the textbooks in the BC Campus collection, and they have their own website that looks just like what David wants of ours, that looks like our website except branded with the Manitoba stuff on it. And so it's localized that to them, but it's a reuse of the content and a reuse of the review process that we use at BC Campus. So it's absolutely starting to spread across the country for sure.
Mm-hmm.
But it's bound to die when it gets closer to Ontario.
Yeah. Ontario does tend to be the central block.
You're going to have to invent it, Claire.
Okay. Since we're laughing, I have a question that has nothing to do with the keynote and has something to do with David's Twitter handle. What's a dendroglyph? I tried to Google it, but I didn't understand. Like, what has that got to do with anything? Because I thought, you know.
So here's the story in 3 sentences. I do a lot of archaeological field work with the U.S. Forest Service. Basque sheep herders moved to the United States during the Franco era. They carved arbor glyphs on aspen trees in the Sierras in western the United States with political manifestos, family histories, all kinds of stuff. So there's a whole research collection around doing that. I was telling a friend who's a professor at Cal Berkeley, and he said, oh man, I hate when people combine Latin and Greek roots. It's really a dendroglyph, not an arbor glyph. So I took that right then and used it.
I think we've all learned something there.
There we go.
You do know the word exists and it refers to something completely different?
No.
That's related to New Zealand? It does. So you thought you'd made up a word, right? That's very interesting. So that's why, like, the other thing is like, what? It's
Well,
like in the Chatham Islands of New Zealand, the indigenous Moriori people practice the art of I don't know what. But it's related to tree carving, so I think there is a relationship. And it's related to shepherds. It's just,
They're
it's
generally
interesting.
called culturally modified trees.
You learn something new on virtually connecting every day, beyond ed tech.
I think we have 5 minutes. There's another group taking over our room.
Okay. So, being mindful of that, anybody have anything else to say, comments, questions before we wrap up and the room gets taken over?
Just thanks for making this happen. This
totally.
is fantastic.
So great.
We should do this weekly.
I agree wholeheartedly.
I did mention in the chat box we should be doing the virtually connecting with all the faculty that we want to have those deep conversations with that we may never get a chance to talk to. So this is going to extend further, I think.
Good.
If you're ever at a conference where you'd like to do this again, or you know people who'd like to do it, this is how we got into OpenEd. We were doing Martin Weller We were having a hangout with Martin Weller at Alt-C in Manchester, and he said, "Are you guys coming to OpenEd?" And we were like, "We can." We can go anywhere, right? And Clint Lalonde got in touch with us, and so any of us who go to conferences, anyone who's interested in being at a conference, any speaker at a conference who wants to share with us, we're open. So all that. We actually had 2 conferences at the same time this time around. We had the National Writing Project annual meeting and this one. So.
Bravo.
Thanks, you guys. It was
Awesome.
really, really lovely. Thanks.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Bye.
Thank you.
And
Bye.
with that, I'm going to take us, or give people an opportunity. Do you want to stay on for a little while and chat?
We're going to head off because I think someone's coming to grab the room. So thanks for hosting, looking after us.
Thank you for the chat. It was really engaging.
Yeah.
We're still on the air if anyone wants to say any post reflections, or if we're done, we could go off the air. Maha, you sound like you wanted to say something.
Yeah, I was actually thinking about what I mean. I've been away from the academic world, even as a student, for a long time. But I remember, for example, here in the public universities, that all the I mean, I can't imagine any of the professors giving up the idea of writing their own books, and some of them felt that they had their own theories about their own subjects, so theirs was better or different or whatever. I'm not sure how that can work. I mean, if they want to collaborate on open.
Since I'm here in Egypt and I have a better context of what you're talking about, what I know also here in Egypt is the faculty who produce that actually profit directly when people buy their textbooks, right?
Yes.
In the U.S.
I didn't want to say how it is.
Yeah. Sorry, Egyptian people.
No,
But in the U.S., I don't think the writer of the book gets that much. I think the publisher gets more profit out of the book than the actual writer, unless the writer is like a really big deal, which is something we were talking about yesterday, I think.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that profit aspect is much lower. I think. I could be wrong. Maybe someone can correct me from the U.S. context.
I think it's lower too, but one of the things that came to mind was I had to go through IRB training or conflict of interest training with research or something like that, and to me that just screams conflict of interest, having your students buy your own textbook. If it were free, I'd say, okay, you know, it's my class, I'm teaching it, I have some things to say, here's a free text. But if you're expecting people to fork out money for it, it doesn't really matter how much you're getting back. That's conflict of interest.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but I mean,
I also think
if you're the person who invented the theory, or if you're the one who's written the best textbook about it, it sounds like, you know, it sounds like a normal thing. It's not necessarily the case for all the Egyptian professors here, but it could be the case occasionally for someone, you know.
Oh yeah, I mean, there's obviously an exception. I think there's also the Greek context. And if I'm not mistaken, at the undergrad level, Greek faculty or departments write their own books, unless there is something really seminal in the field that they need to use outside of the text. But I think those might be free and subsidized as part of your going to university.
Oh, that's good. So it's kind of like part of their job as a professor to write the textbook, and then it's part of the university's offerings.
I think so. Right. Sort of like a study guide in an open university context.
Yeah. Here they do this, but they make you pay for the study guide, right?
Wow.
Right? I think. But the university is free almost. So
yes.
Public universities, you pay almost nothing to get in, so that's...
Yeah, well, compared to the U.S. or anywhere else, I guess, where the tuition is very high, yeah, it's almost free.
So the opportunity for OER, open resources, open textbooks, is it a totally different context for you in Egypt then?
But it would be relevant for something else. So I mean, my husband is a medical doctor, and so of course they do have to use a lot of textbooks from the not from here, from the US or the UK or whatever. And what ends up happening, and I wrote this about on Prof Hacker earlier this week, is that people end up buying illegal copies of the books because the books are so expensive, unless there's a third world edition that's like a little bit cheaper. The books are so expensive that they would never get an education unless either one of their professors wrote a cheaper version that was probably plagiarized, I don't know if it is, or if they get illegal copies. And that's how people survive. That's how people get educated over here, illegal copies of textbooks. And sometimes, at my university, where we're pretty privileged, an elite American university in Cairo, and where copyright is a huge issue, occasionally we order the books and they get here too late, and the semester's already started. And someone is depending on that textbook, and for some reason it's stuck in customs or whatever, and the university can't officially buy an illegal textbook, but students go out and find a way to get it from universities in the other, one of the public universities they're selling it or whatever, because that's just, you got to make something work.
Well, it also reminds me, when I was a master's level student, some of the textbooks I got on half.com or eBay, it didn't matter to me if the edition was one edition behind because I was saving a lot of money. And then what I got in the mail was the quote international edition, and it had this big note on it: it cannot be sold outside of India, Bangladesh, China, and a few other countries. I'm like, oh, well, I guess somebody broke the law sending it to me and me buying this book, but got it now. I'm going to use it for my class.
I have a quick question. Another thing that I mean, if anybody can answer this, I wasn't sure why they feel that the that having several versions or edited versions of the same textbook was a problem to in the sense that they didn't know about to track exactly.
Well, I mean, I think, are you talking about options like GitHub that already does that for you? I think, or do you
or
really
wikis
mean
or
why
anything?
Do they care?
No,
No, but I mean, what they're thinking about is forks. They're
Mhm.
talking about forking the textbook, so not just changing a version as in it's like a new edition of a book, but can people fork a textbook, keep a completely different copy in it, a completely different place that changes it a little bit? What happens is, like, if I'm teaching, for example, beginner level chemistry, and I know that BC, University of British Columbia, have one, and then I don't like it very much, I'd like to be able to see if someone else has another copy that they've changed a little bit, because maybe that one fits my needs instead of me having to do that. And so I think GitHub does that for you, so that takes up from the open source community. But the thing is, a lot of open textbooks are just PDFs or wikis.
Right.
And so you have access to it, but you don't know how to change it, and you don't know if someone else has taken that text and done something else with it somewhere else and doesn't necessarily track it back. And the thing with Creative Commons licensing is that nobody even has to tell you that they've taken your work. They just have to attribute it, right? So I think that was the issue.
All right.
And before it signs off, I'm doing a couple of webinars with a Web 2.0 tool, Scalar, S-C-A-L-A-R, and it is specifically for web publishing. And it's textbook, but it's a web version of a textbook. Take a look at it. There's a couple of webinars coming up in early December around that product. I'm going to try one in the not too distant future just to see what it can do for me. So just an option.
Cool. And with that, I am going to say that we're signing off live. Do catch our next Hangout today in a couple of hours, and we'll be posting more info on that on the Virtual Connecting Twitter account. With us, we will have Amy Collier, Jen Ross, and Viv Rolfe. Hope to see you there in a couple of hours. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.